Today we stand at a critical moment in our nation's history, a moment that highlights both the strength of our democratic institutions and the importance of the rule of law. The recent ruling by the U.S. Court of Appeals that Trump's tariffs were illegal is more than just a judicial decision about trade policy. It is a profound reaffirmation of the principle that the rule of law is the foundation of American democracy. When we speak of the rule of law, we are referring to a simple but powerful idea that laws apply equally to everyone, no matter how much power they hold. The president, like any citizen, is bound by the legal framework established by the Constitution and Congress. This ruling demonstrates that even the highest office in the land is subject to checks and balances, and that authority cannot be exercised outside the limits of the law. For years, trade tariffs imposed under the Trump administration were justified under the argument of protecting American industry and workers. While that narrative carried political appeal, the question was never just about economics. It was also about legality. The Constitution grants Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. When tariffs are imposed in ways that bypass or stretch that authority, they risk undermining the separation of powers, concentrating too much control in the hands of one branch of government. The court's decision highlights the danger of such overreach and reaffirms the principle that government action must align with the legal boundaries set forth by the Constitution. This is not the first time in American history that the courts have stepped in to remind leaders of their limits, and it will not be the last. The judiciary is designed to be an independent arbiter, ensuring that actions taken by the executive and legislative branches remain within legal bounds. If presidents could unilaterally impose policies without regard to the law, the very essence of democracy would be at risk. The court's ruling on the tariffs should be seen as part of a broader tradition where the courts act as guardians of the rule of law, ensuring that no individual can bend the system to their personal or political will. The impact of this decision goes far beyond the tariffs themselves. It sends a signal, both to current leaders and to future administrations, that governing requires adherence to established rules. It underscores that power must be exercised responsibly and transparently. The American people depend on their leaders to act within the law, not outside of it. When courts step in to correct overreach, they are not interfering with governance. They are protecting the public and preserving the balance that sustains democracy. This ruling strengthens the credibility of the United States on the global stage. Nations around the world watch how America handles its internal disputes and whether its institutions remain strong. By showing that the judiciary can hold even the president accountable, the U.S. reaffirms its commitment to being a country where fairness and justice prevail over arbitrary power. This credibility is essential for building trust with allies, in negotiating trade agreements, and leading in international affairs. A nation that fails to enforce its own laws cannot expect others to respect its commitments. The rule of law is not a partisan concept. It does not belong to Republicans or Democrats, conservatives or progressives. It is the common ground upon which the entire system of governance rests. Citizens may disagree about policies, ideologies, or strategies, but they cannot disagree about the necessity of legal boundaries. The moment we allow political expedience to override the rule of law, we set a dangerous precedent that can be exploited by anyone in power, regardless of party. That is why this court ruling should be welcomed not as a partisan victory or defeat, but as a victory for democracy itself. The lesson from this moment is clear. America's greatness lies not in the unchecked authority of its leaders, but in the resilience of its institutions and the fairness of its laws. The tariffs may have been promoted as a way to protect American interests, but when implemented outside of legal boundaries, they became a threat to the very system they claimed to defend. The courts have reminded us that the presidency is not a position of absolute power, but one bound by law, accountability, and respect for constitutional limits. This is the essence of the rule of law, and it is what keeps our democracy strong. When we talk about tariffs, it is easy to view them only as abstract numbers or policy tools debated in Washington, But tariffs are not just lines on a balance sheet or points in a political argument. They have a real and tangible impact on the economy and on people's everyday lives. The tariffs imposed during the Trump administration were defended as a strategy to protect American workers and industries from unfair foreign competition. However, as the years unfolded, it became clear that the costs of these tariffs were not limited to foreign exporters. They reverberated throughout the U.S. economy, touching farmers, manufacturers, small businesses, and ordinary families in ways that cannot be ignored. One of the most immediate consequences of tariffs is the increase in prices for imported goods. When tariffs are placed on products coming from overseas, companies that rely on those imports must either absorb the extra costs or pass them on to consumers. In many cases, they chose the latter. This meant higher prices for everyday items such as electronics, household goods, and even clothing. For working families already stretched by the cost of living, the tariffs acted as an invisible tax. Unlike income taxes, which are scaled to earnings, tariffs disproportionately affected low and middle-income Americans who spend a larger share of their budget on goods. Farmers were among those hit the hardest. Many U.S. agricultural products, especially soybeans, pork, and corn, became collateral damage in the trade wars that followed the tariff policies. Other nations retaliated by imposing their own tariffs on American exports, shutting farmers out of crucial international markets. What was framed as a way to protect American jobs ended up jeopardizing the livelihoods of those who grow the nation's food supply. Billions of dollars in federal subsidies were later handed out to offset these losses. But subsidies are not a permanent solution. They mask the problem temporarily without addressing the long-term damage done to America's reputation as a reliable trading partner. Manufacturers, too, felt the strain. Many industries in the United States rely on raw materials and parts imported from abroad. Tariffs on steel and aluminum, for instance, raised production costs for car makers, construction firms, and appliance manufacturers. Some companies scaled back production, delayed expansion, or laid off workers because the increased costs made it harder to compete globally. The ripple effect extended to supply chains, creating uncertainty that discouraged investment. Businesses thrive on stability, and when policy decisions inject volatility into the market, the result is hesitation, slowed growth, and reduced confidence. Small businesses were in an even more precarious position. Unlike large corporations with the resources to absorb higher costs or shift supply chains, small firms often had no choice but to either raise prices or reduce operations. A small retail store importing goods for resale or a small manufacturer relying on imported components could not easily adjust. For many of them, the tariffs meant slimmer profit margins, tougher decisions about staffing, and in some cases, closure. Consumers, farmers, manufacturers, and small businesses together make up the backbone of the American economy. When each of these groups suffers from increased costs, lost markets, or reduced confidence, the broader economy cannot escape unscathed. Tariffs are often sold as a tool to create jobs, but history shows they frequently have the opposite effect. Jobs tied to industries that rely on imports are just as important as jobs in industries producing exports. When one sector gains temporary relief, another may bear the burden. Internationally, the economic impact was equally significant. Allies and trade partners responded to the tariffs not with cooperation, but with retaliation. This tit-for-tat escalation not only deepened economic strain, but also undermined relationships that had taken decades to build. Trust between nations in trade is not easily repaired, and the uncertainty caused by these disputes weakened America's position as a reliable global economic leader. The economic impact of the tariffs underscores a larger lesson. Policies cannot be judged solely on political appeal or slogans. They must be evaluated on how they affect the entire ecosystem of the economy. Protecting one group at the expense of many others is neither sustainable nor fair. While the intent may have been to strengthen American industry, the reality was higher costs, disrupted markets, and weakened confidence. The court ruling that the tariffs were illegal only amplifies this truth. These measures did not just strain the economy, they did so while falling outside the law. In the end, the true cost was not only measured in dollars and cents, but also in lost opportunities, strained trust, and the everyday struggles of families and businesses across the country, the judiciary in the United States serves as one of the most vital pillars of democracy, entrusted with the responsibility of interpreting laws, protecting constitutional rights, and ensuring that the actions of government remain within the boundaries set by the Constitution. The ruling by the U.S. Court of Appeals that Trump's tariffs were illegal is a vivid example of this responsibility in action. It demonstrates how the courts act not as political actors, but as guardians of the rule of law, making sure that no branch of government, including the executive, exceeds its lawful authority. At the heart of the American system of governance lies the principle of separation of powers. The framers of the Constitution carefully designed a system in which the legislative, executive, and judicial branches would check and balance one another to prevent the concentration of power in any single branch. While the president holds significant authority in carrying out foreign policy and trade negotiations, the Constitution clearly grants Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. When the executive branch moves beyond those limits, the judiciary has the duty to step in and draw the line. This is precisely what occurred with the tariffs ruling. The judiciary's role is often misunderstood. Courts do not exist to promote one party's ideology or to protect the interests of any particular group. Instead, they exist to uphold the law as it is written and to interpret it when disputes arise. This neutrality is what makes the judiciary so powerful. By standing apart from political winds and public pressures, judges ensure that the law itself, not personal opinion or temporary popularity, governs the nation's decisions. The appeals court's decision reminds us that even when a policy is popular with certain groups or justified under political slogans, it cannot stand if it contradicts the law. Another important aspect of the judiciary's role is to provide a forum where individuals, businesses, and even entire industries can challenge government action. Without this recourse, citizens would be left powerless against decisions that might harm them, even if those decisions were unlawful. The tariffs ruling shows how courts give voice to those who suffer the consequences of overreach. By providing a mechanism for review and redress, the judiciary ensures that the government remains accountable to the people. It is also worth noting the judiciary's function in preserving stability and predictability. The economy, businesses, and individuals all rely on the certainty that laws will be applied consistently. When the executive branch acts unilaterally in ways that upset this balance, uncertainty spreads, investors hesitate, businesses slow their expansion, and international partners question the reliability of the United States. By stepping in and declaring the tariffs unlawful, the court reaffirmed that there are limits to executive action, restoring a sense of order to the legal and economic framework. Some critics argue that the judiciary's intervention in such matters hampers decisive leadership. They claim that courts are unelected bodies interfering with the will of the people, but this critique overlooks the very design of American democracy. The will of the people is expressed through laws passed by Congress, not through unchecked executive power. When courts enforce those laws and keep the presidency within its proper limits, they are not obstructing democracy, they are protecting it. Judicial review is not an obstacle to governance. It is the safeguard that prevents governance from slipping into authoritarianism. The ruling also highlights the independence of the judiciary, a quality that is crucial to its legitimacy. Judges are not swayed by political campaigns or partisan loyalty in the same way elected officials often are. This independence allows them to make decisions that are unpopular but necessary, ensuring that justice is served even when it comes at a political cost. By declaring the tariffs illegal, the judiciary reinforced its commitment to impartiality and its willingness to check the other branches of government, regardless of the political implications. In a larger sense, the judiciary's role is not only to resolve individual disputes, but also to preserve the integrity of the democratic system itself. When people lose faith that the law is applied fairly, democracy weakens. By contrast, when courts demonstrate their independence and uphold constitutional principles, they strengthen public trust in the system. The Tariffs ruling serves as a reminder that the courts remain vigilant, standing as a bulwark against abuses of power and as a protector of the constitutional order. The judiciary's role in this case underscores why it is often called the guardian of the Constitution. Its decisions ripple far beyond the courtroom, shaping the way power is exercised and reminding every leader that authority is not absolute. By affirming that the president's tariffs were illegal, the appeals court reaffirmed that in America, law and justice, not political will, define the boundaries of governance. That is the essence of the judiciary's role, and it is what keeps democracy alive. Accountability is the cornerstone of democracy. Without it, power can be abused, trust in government can erode, and the very legitimacy of democratic institutions can collapse. The recent ruling that Trump's tariffs were illegal is a vivid reminder that those in positions of authority must answer not only to the people but also to the law. Accountability ensures that leaders do not act on impulse or personal interest, but instead remain bound by the responsibilities of their office and the constraints of the Constitution. When we talk about accountability, it is important to understand that it exists at multiple levels. At the most immediate level, elected officials are accountable to the voters who put them in office. Citizens have the right to evaluate their leaders' performance and to express approval or disapproval through the ballot box. But accountability cannot end there, because elections happen only every few years and because the damage of unchecked actions can be swift and severe. This is why legal and institutional accountability is equally necessary. Courts, oversight committees, and other independent bodies exist to ensure that power is exercised within the boundaries of law and that leaders face consequences if they overstep. The tariffs ruling shows how essential this type of accountability is. By imposing tariffs outside the lawful scope of executive authority, the administration created economic disruptions that affected millions of Americans. Families paid higher prices, farmers lost access to markets, and businesses faced uncertainty. The court stepping in to declare these tariffs unlawful was not just a legal exercise, it was an act of accountability. It said clearly that even if an action is taken in the name of protecting the nation, it must still comply with the rules that govern our democracy. Leaders cannot simply claim necessity or urgency to justify breaking the law. Accountability also plays a role in preserving fairness. Without it, the system tilts toward those in power, leaving ordinary citizens at risk of exploitation. If a president or any official could act without restraint, the balance of democracy would be lost, and citizens would bear the brunt of decisions made without regard for legality or justice. The tariffs ruling restored that balance by holding the executive branch to the same standard that applies to all. It reinforced the idea that fairness requires transparency, oversight, and consequences for overreach. Beyond the immediate effects, accountability builds long-term trust in institutions. People are more likely to accept decisions, even difficult or unpopular ones, if they believe those decisions were made lawfully and with proper oversight. Conversely, when leaders act without accountability, cynicism and distrust spread. Citizens begin to question whether the system is rigged or whether those in power are simply above the law. This erosion of trust can be far more damaging than any single policy mistake because it weakens the bonds that hold a society together. By reaffirming accountability in this case, the courts help to restore confidence that the system still works and that laws still matter. Another critical dimension of accountability is deterrence. When one leader is held accountable for unlawful actions, it sends a message to future leaders: the rules apply to you as well. This creates a culture of restraint, reminding those in office that they are stewards of authority, not owners of it. Without accountability, the temptation to test boundaries or ignore limits grows stronger. With it, leaders are more likely to govern responsibly, knowing that there are consequences for defiance. Importantly, accountability is not about punishing individuals for the sake of punishment. It is about ensuring that the system as a whole functions properly. In the case of the tariffs, Accountability did not mean that a president could not pursue policies to protect American workers. It simply meant that such policies must be pursued through legal channels, involving Congress where required and respecting constitutional limits. Accountability does not block leadership, it guides it. The need for accountability speaks to the heart of what it means to live in a democracy. It is not enough to elect leaders and trust them to do the right thing. Systems of accountability must be in place to monitor, review, and, when necessary, correct their actions. The Tariffs ruling reminds us that leadership without limits is dangerous, but leadership with accountability is what makes democracy strong and sustainable. In holding the executive branch responsible for its overreach, the courts reminded the nation that authority in America is not absolute. It is conditional, bound by law, and always subject to the scrutiny of the people and the institutions that represent them. The ruling that Trump's tariffs were illegal does not just close a chapter in a legal battle. It opens the door to an important discussion about the future of trade policy and governance in the United States. It challenges lawmakers, leaders, and citizens alike to ask, where do we go from here? The answer lies not in looking backward at partisan debates, but in shaping a path forward that respects the law, protects American workers, and strengthens the nation's role in the global economy. The way ahead must be built on legality, collaboration, and a vision for long-term stability rather than short-term political victories. The first step in moving forward is reasserting the rightful role of Congress in trade policy. The Constitution clearly grants Congress the authority to regulate commerce with foreign nations. Over the decades, however, Congress has ceded much of that power to the executive branch, often for the sake of efficiency or expedience. The tariffs ruling exposes the risks of that trend. When one branch accumulates too much authority, the balance of power is disrupted, and decisions that should involve broader debate and oversight are made unilaterally. Restoring Congress's leadership in trade policy does not mean slowing progress. It means ensuring that decisions are lawful, transparent, and reflective of a wider range of voices. The second step is to rebuild trust with international partners. Tariffs and retaliatory measures have strained America's relationships with allies and disrupted global supply chains. Moving forward, the United States must demonstrate that it remains committed to fair and reliable trade practices. This does not mean abandoning the goal of protecting American industries. Rather, it means pursuing those goals through negotiation, cooperation, and lawful agreements instead of abrupt and unilateral tariffs. By re-engaging in global forums and working with allies, the United States can create stronger, more sustainable trade partnerships that benefit workers and consumers at home. At the same time, the path forward must involve crafting policies that directly address the concerns of American workers who feel left behind by globalization. Tariffs may have been an attempt to protect them, but they often backfired, raising costs instead of creating security. A better approach is to invest in domestic industries, provide training for workers to adapt to changing markets, and create incentives for innovation and competitiveness. By focusing on strengthening the American workforce rather than punishing trading partners, leaders can create long-term growth without violating the law. Another critical aspect of the path forward is clarity. Businesses and farmers need predictability in order to plan, invest, and grow. Sudden tariffs imposed without proper legal authority created chaos in markets and left industries unsure about the future. Policymakers must establish a more transparent process for trade decisions, one that involves consultation with stakeholders, proper congressional oversight, and a clear legal foundation. Predictability does not stifle leadership, it enables it by giving industries the confidence to move forward, knowing that policies will not change overnight. There is also an opportunity to modernize trade policy for a new era. The global economy is shifting with technology, climate change, and geopolitical tensions reshaping markets in unprecedented ways. Rather than relying on outdated tools like broad tariffs, the United States can lead by developing innovative agreements that address these emerging realities. This might mean crafting trade policies that incentivize clean energy, protect digital commerce, or ensure resilience in critical supply chains. The ruling against the tariff should not discourage bold action. It should redirect it into more constructive, lawful channels. The ruling against the tariffs is not just a judgment on the past, but an invitation to build a better future. It is a call to restore balance between the branches of government, rebuild trust with global partners, and design policies that truly protect American workers without undermining the law. The path forward will not be easy, but it offers an opportunity for the United States to lead with both strength and integrity. By embracing accountability, collaboration, and innovation, America can create a trade policy that is not only lawful but also lasting, fair, and worthy of its democratic ideals. At the heart of the court's ruling that Trump's tariffs were illegal lies a fundamental truth about America. The nation's strength comes not from bending or ignoring the rules, but from upholding them. The core reminder here is that the rule of law, fairness, and accountability are not optional principles. They are the foundation of democracy itself. This moment is not just about tariffs or trade. It is about reaffirming that America's greatness rests on its ability to remain a country where laws guide leadership, where institutions hold power in check, and where the people can trust that their system of government will not be undermined by unilateral actions. It is easy in the heat of political battles to believe that ends justify means. A policy that promises protection for American workers, for example, might seem worth supporting even if its legality is questionable. But the court's ruling reminds us that in a democracy, the means are just as important as the ends. When leaders pursue goals outside of legal boundaries, they may achieve short-term victories, but they weaken the system in the long run. The tariffs ruling is a clear message that such shortcuts are not sustainable. America cannot afford to sacrifice the integrity of its laws for political expedience, no matter how noble the intention may appear. The reminder also extends to the idea of checks and balances. The framers of the Constitution designed a system in which no single branch of government could dominate the others. By ruling against the tariffs, the judiciary reinforced this balance, showing that even the most powerful office in the land must operate within limits. This is not about diminishing the presidency. It is about preserving the framework that keeps power distributed fairly. Without this reminder, future leaders might see unchecked authority as acceptable, paving the way for abuses far more dangerous than trade disputes. Another part of the reminder is about fairness to the people. When tariffs were imposed unlawfully, it was ordinary citizens who bore the costs, farmers who lost export markets, small businesses that faced higher expenses, families that paid more at the checkout line. The court's ruling reminds us that laws are not abstract principles. They exist to protect people from arbitrary power. Fairness requires that leaders follow the same rules as everyone else, and fairness requires that when those rules are broken, there are consequences. This ensures that government remains a servant of the people, not a master over them. The reminder also applies to America's role in the world. For decades, the United States has positioned itself as a global leader in advocating for democracy, fairness, and rule-based systems. When the government acts outside of its own laws, it undermines that credibility. The tariffs ruling signals to allies and rivals alike that the United States still honors its principles and that its institutions remain strong. America leads not by force alone, but by the example it sets in respecting rules and holding itself accountable. This reminder is especially important in a world where authoritarian regimes often act without such constraints. At a deeper level, the core reminder is about trust. Citizens must trust that their government operates within the law, and governments must trust that their institutions will enforce those laws consistently. Trust is fragile. It can be lost quickly if leaders act without restraint, but it can be strengthened when institutions demonstrate their independence and fairness. The court's decision is a reminder that the system can still be trusted, that the safeguards put in place centuries ago are still functioning, and that the people's rights are still being protected. The lesson is simple but profound. America's strength lies in its commitment to the rule of law, not in the unchecked will of any one leader. Power without limits is not leadership, it is danger. Leadership bound by law, accountability, and fairness is what sustains a democracy. The tariffs ruling is a reminder that while policies come and go and administrations rise and fall, the principles of law and justice must remain constant. If America remembers this truth, if it remembers that fairness, accountability, and respect for democratic institutions are non-negotiable, then it will continue to thrive, not only as a powerful nation, but as a just one.